Ever notice how the cruelest punishments rarely ended fast? They stayed slow on purpose, so everyone had time to stare and learn the lesson. Crowds swore they felt sick, yet they still pushed closer, then went home and repeated every detail like a warning story. Today, I'm breaking down the most brutal executions in history, and the first one will make you ask, who decided this was justice? Let's start with number 10. Ling Chi. Ever heard a punishment name and thought, no way that existed in real life? Hold that thought, because this one lasted until 1905, and that date feels wrong in your head. Ling Chi gets called 1,000 cuts, and people say it like a spooky legend, but this sat inside a real Chinese legal system for about 1,000 years. Think about that. Roughly from the 10th century until the ban in 1905, the government could sentence someone to this as an official punishment, with paperwork, officials, and witnesses. How does something that brutal stay normal for that long? Britannica describes it as slow slicing. The condemned got tied to a post, and pieces of flesh were cut away over time, and sometimes the ending came through a cut to the heart, or decapitation. That detail matters because it shows the method had an endpoint built in, and it also shows how the state controlled the pace. What would your brain do while you waited for the last cut, knowing the crowd also waited? Ling Chi showed up for especially serious crimes, and later scholarship on Qing reform points out that punishments labeled cruel became targets during reform efforts in the dynasty's last years. That means the push to remove it happened in the same era China tried to modernize law itself, and the ban in 1905 sits right in that clash. One major modern study follows how Ling Chi shaped the Western image of China, while arguing the reality often got misdescribed abroad. So the method stayed real, the fear stayed real, yet the story grew into a larger nightmare symbol anyway. And that part should bother you, because public punishment keeps living in people's minds even after the state finally ends it. Keep listening, because one man's silence turns law into a slow crush. Here comes number 9, peine forte et dure. Imagine a courtroom where one word could save you and you refuse to say it. That decision sounds small until the law answers with stones and time. Peine forte et dure means strong and hard punishment, and it got used when an accused person stood mute and refused to plead. No dramatic chase, no battlefield, just a legal system that treats silence as a problem it can solve with weight. Britannica points to a famous case in the American colonies, Giles Corey, around 80 years old, during the Salem witch trials in 1692. Corey refused trial, and under that logic he could be pressed with stone weights until he entered a plea, or until he died. A Massachusetts Historical Society entry using Samuel Sewall's diary dates his death to September 19, 1692, after 2 days of pressure. 2 days. That number changes everything because this became a long event, a slow public lesson, and every extra stone turned law into a physical attack. If a system can do that to an old man, what does it do to everyone watching? Corey's motive stays famous because it makes harsh sense. Britannica says he chose to refuse trial rather than forfeit his family's goods, since pleading could lead to property loss that hit his heirs. So the pain had a purpose: land, inheritance, and the state trying to force cooperation out of a body. Britannica also calls Corey's case one of the few colonial examples, which makes it stand out even more. Salem saw something extreme enough that people still talk about it centuries later. And the scary part, it happened under rules, with officials acting like this was procedure. Now picture a device that turns killing into tighten and wait. If you are still here, you are built for this series. Hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment with the method you never expected, because the next chapter flips the timeline in a way that feels unreal. Let's move to number 8, Garrote-Ville. A machine can make violence feel orderly, and that should scare you, because when the machine works badly, the suffering stretches out in real minutes. Britannica describes the garrote as a device for strangling condemned people, often an iron collar attached to a post, tightened with a screw until asphyxiation happens. That setup matters because it turns execution into a mechanical process, adjusting, rotating, keeping tightening, and watching the body react. It looks controlled, like the state built a tool to remove emotion from killing. But what happens when control turns into a slow struggle? One name locks this method into modern memory: Salvador Puig Antich. He was executed in Barcelona on March 2, 1974, at age 25, by garrote vil under Franco's regime. The year 1974 hits like a slap because it sounds like a time with cars, televisions, and living people who remember the day. El País reported a military doctor certified his death, and the agony lasted roughly 20 minutes. That detail ruins any idea of a quick mechanical ending. 20 minutes means witnesses, clocks, and a person choking while officials wait for the body to stop. El País also calls him the last person executed by garrote vil in Spain, and later notes Spain's democratic memory laws declared the original process null, meaning the state eventually treated the case as unjust. So you get a brutal mix, an old-sounding method, a modern-sounding year, and an execution remembered partly because the order failed. And if you think the next method sounds unreal, that reaction is exactly the point. Because some horrors survive mainly through words people keep repeating. Next one is number 7. Sawing asunder. This one lives in your head the second you hear it. Then you go looking for clean records, and the trail turns into belief and tradition. Sawing asunder means being cut apart with a saw while alive, and it survives in public memory because the idea feels like maximum terror. But compared with the other methods here, the strongest references come from religious tradition and textual memory more than neat court documentation. Hebrews 11:37 contains the line, "They were sawn asunder," and scholars connect that wording to the ascension of Isaiah, where Isaiah is described as dying this way. That shift matters because it changes the kind of proof you are dealing with. With Salem, you get names and dates. With Barcelona, you get a specific day. Here, you get scripture, tradition, and the way stories travel across centuries. Does that make it fake? No. It makes it harder to pin down like a court file, and that uncertainty becomes the hook. Ask yourself a different question. Why did this image survive around 2,000 years? People kept repeating it because it carried fear, slow cutting, helplessness, and spectacle turned into memory. In the ancient world, terrifying punishments often lived on through stories that mattered because people believed them and feared them, and repetition kept the fear alive. So the detail that sticks here is the uncertainty itself. Many punishments arrive through verdicts and ledgers. This one arrives through belief, scripture, and tradition, and that means the idea outlived any single regime. And when an idea lasts that long, it still shapes what people imagine a state can do. Ready for a method with witnesses, dates, and a shocking number of swings? Let's move to number 6. Beheading. People talk about beheading like one clean motion and done. Then you hear 3 blows, and the clean story collapses. Beheading is one of the oldest execution methods on record, but the instant version depends on skill, tools, and luck. Historic Royal Palaces says that when Thomas Cromwell was executed on July 28, 1540, it took 3 blows of the axe to sever his head. 3. That number forces you to picture pauses between strikes, a crowd reacting, and a powerful minister dying messily on Tower Hill. Now notice how one number changes your whole mental image. People imagine a single swing because it feels simpler to process, but history hands you 3 blows instead. And once you accept that, you start asking the uncomfortable question, how many other quick executions turned into drawn-out scenes because the person holding the weapon lacked skill. Then, France tries to fix the messy human part with a machine. Britannica explains the guillotine became France's standard decapitation device, and Nicolas Jacques Pelletier became its first victim on April 25, 1792. Later, according to a widely cited summary, the machine killed more than 10,000 people in France. That number changes the scale from one tragic execution to industrial routine. So the contrast becomes brutal. One side gives you clumsy violence, an axe that needs 3 swings. The other side gives you a system built for repeatable efficiency, and the body becomes a unit in a standardized process. Which kind of brutality sits heavier with you, the messy failure or the smooth routine? Now, let's go somewhere with almost no crowd at all. Here comes number 5. Strangulation. Some executions aim for spectacle, and some aim for removal. This one feels cold because it can happen in silence, underground. In ancient Rome, strangulation could happen inside the Tullianum, the lower chamber of the Mamertine prison. Site-based and historical summaries describe condemned prisoners being lowered through a circular opening into a dark, foul-smelling space, then held there until execution. Usually by strangulation or decapitation. Sallust described the place as filthy, dark, and terrifying. And that description matters because the room itself starts punishing you before anyone touches you. One anchor event is the Catiline conspiracy. Publius Cornelius Lentulus Sura, a leading conspirator, died on December 5, 63 BC, and Roman tradition ties these conspirators' deaths to execution in the Tullianum after Cicero pushed for swift action. Notice the style: private, compressed, politically charged. No grand scaffold, no roar of a crowd. Just the state deciding the moment and the place. Another number deepens the chill. The prison is usually dated back to around the 7th century BC, which means this chamber stood for centuries as a tool for the Roman state to handle people labeled dangerous. Centuries of power, and the same stone space keeps doing the same work. That is why strangulation here feels different from burning or stoning. It strips away performance and leaves disposal, the state making problems vanish in darkness. And when you remove the spectacle, you also remove witnesses, which changes what the public can even argue about later. Now watch how water turns into a legal tool across Europe. Let's move to number 4, drowning. A river can look calm, even friendly, until someone calls it a sentence. Then water stops being scenery and becomes part of the court's toolkit. Drowning as punishment shows up across medieval and early modern Europe, and a PBS history of the death penalty notes that many barons had a drowning pit as well as gallows. That detail matters because it means drowning could be built into local power, a physical feature of authority, sitting there like a grim piece of property. PBS also gives a brutal statistic. In 1279, 200 Jews were drowned after being accused of clipping the king's coin. That single year and number hit hard because it shows scale, not a lone tragic case, but a mass punishment carried out through water. And water does something that fire and blades do not. It can hide mess. It can erase evidence. It can look like nature while being policy. Judicial drowning lasted a long time. Summaries describe it surviving in parts of Europe into the 16th, 17th, and even 18th centuries, with some regions recording surprisingly late cases. Then, a scholarly article on Antwerp adds a disturbing twist. Between 1557 and 1565, authorities carried out many executions of religious dissidents by secret drowning instead of public spectacle. That flips the mood completely. In one place, drowning becomes public humiliation. In another, it becomes hidden state violence, done quietly, away from crowds, away from scrutiny. So here is the question that should stick with you. Which version scares you more? The one done in front of everyone, or the one done where nobody can prove it later? Now imagine a method where the crowd becomes the weapon itself. Next one is number 3, stoning. This method turns ordinary objects into a killing system, and once the crowd joins in, responsibility spreads out like smoke. Stoning is ancient, but the procedure can be more structured than people assume. In Mishnah Sanhedrin 6:4, the place of execution is described as twice a man's height. One witness pushes the condemned from above. If the fall does not kill him, a heavy stone is dropped on his chest. If he still lives, the wider group stones him. That sequence matters because it shows stages, witnesses, and a grim logic, and it makes the crowd part of the process. Now think about what that does to the human brain. With a sword or an axe, you can point at one executioner. With stones, the violence gets shared, and each person can tell themselves they played a small part, almost nothing. That shared action also makes it harder for anyone to stop, because the group energy becomes its own engine. Britannica gives a historical anchor, Saint Stephen, dated to 36 CE in Jerusalem. He is widely remembered as the first Christian martyr, killed by stoning after enraging his audience with his defense of the faith. That date matters because it places the method in a real political and religious struggle in the early Roman world, with a city, a year, and a named victim. So the disturbing core here is shared violence. A crowd can become a machine without gears, without screws, without a single person feeling fully responsible. And once a culture learns that trick, it becomes easy to repeat. Now brace yourself, because Rome had a clean hands workaround. Let's move to number 2, live entombment. This one sounds almost polite at first, like we just lock a door. Then you realize the door locks time in with you, and time never shows mercy. Live entombment, also called immurement, kills by sealing a person into confinement and letting time finish the job. In Roman religion, the most famous example involves the Vestal Virgins. Britannica says Vestals served 30 years, were chosen young, and could be punished by burial alive if they violated the vow of chastity, because a Vestal's blood could not be spilled. That single rule changes everything, because it creates a death penalty designed to avoid visible blood while still delivering death. So picture the ritual logic. The state keeps its religious rule intact and still removes the person. A chamber underground, limited provisions, a formal process, and public meaning wrapped around something deeply cruel. People watching could pretend the authorities kept their hands clean, even though the outcome stayed the same. This method also flips expectations. Many people imagine ancient punishments as loud, violent, and obvious. This one works through sealing, silence, and waiting. And that quiet can feel worse, because the victim fades away out of sight, and the public moves on. Britannica also notes Vestals held remarkable privileges in Rome, including control over property and status far beyond most women of their time. So when a Vestal fell from that height to burial alive, each case became a public lesson about purity, power, and fear, played out with a locked space instead of a blade. And once you hear that, fire starts to feel like a different kind of threat. Because one teenage girl's execution has a date almost everyone remembers. And the last is number 1, burning at the stake. You already know the image: flames, smoke, a crowd watching. But the date, May 30th, 1431, makes it feel painfully specific. Britannica states that Joan of Arc was burned to death on May 30th, 1431, at age 19, after being condemned as a relapsed heretic. Her trial began on January 9th, 1431, and Britannica notes that when the proceedings got moving, she answered 70 charges drawn up against her. More than 70 accusations appear in Britannica's broader summary, and that detail matters because it shows pressure being built through paperwork, article after article, aimed at a teenager who had become politically dangerous. Burning at the stake often carried a public message beyond death. The method aimed to declare that the victim's ideas, identity, or religious standing needed public purging. Joan's case shows that clearly because she had become a symbol tied to the 100 Years' War, and the trial functioned as an attempt to destroy that symbol in front of witnesses. But the story refuses a clean ending. In 1455–56, Pope Calixtus III annulled the sentence. So within about 25 years, the Church formally reversed the condemnation that sent her to the flames. That reversal lands hard, because the fire was meant to end the story. Yet the case turned into one of history's biggest martyr narratives anyway. So when people say execution ends everything, this case pushes back. The state got the moment, but memory kept running in the opposite direction, and it kept running for centuries.